And we're rolling. All right. So I'd like to introduce you guys to our lovely speaker, Andrew Davis, for tonight. He's the head of Synergist Communications. He's a former industry technical writer and has a reputation for both understanding and championing the role of content development. He's now a recruiter and recruits technical writers, technical trainers, courseware developers, instructional designers, technical marketing writers for challenging staff and content and contract roles. Andrew enjoys helping those communicate complex information, and helps them get ahead by recognizing and refining their value to I can't talk technology companies. He's candid and connected, and just as importantly, he likes to help tech industry workers gain their independence and operate without intermediaries. He'd be happy to recruit you or recruit for you if you want his help. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Andrew Davis.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Thank you all for being here this evening. Paul and Denny, thank you especially. I expect to be heckled. Okay, so I'm here this evening to opine from my small perspective of recruiting for 26 years in the San Francisco Bay Area on the impact on tech comm careers that the recent pandemic has wrought, I guess. So I'm going to go through my slides, but I don't want you to take notes because I've supplied in the chat window a long, like 8 pages worth of speaker's notes. Everything I say, well, almost everything I say, will be there. And I want you to take notes of your questions so that we can have an entertaining and engaging Q&A session afterward. So here's our agenda, and here we go. We don't know exactly when the pandemic will end worldwide. It's certainly recurring in India. It's getting nasty again in Japan, and who knows when the variants will happen. But what we can say is that our living and our work status arrangements have caused COVID to affect everyone differently. Those who are single and have nothing to do but work respond differently to pandemics, I've learned, than people who have kids homeschooling from the same kitchen table they're trying to use to work. It's gotten complicated and stressful. I would go so far as to say in many cases people are fried from the impact, from the stress of this pandemic. So let's hope it resolves to everybody's benefit quickly. So for a lot of companies, jobs disappeared and companies folded or went on, quote, indefinite hiatus. You remember those days about this time last year. In high tech, I've noticed that most technical communicators transitioned quickly to offsite work from home status. Everybody had been telling me for years and years that would be a dream come true, that everybody wanted to work from home, no longer commute, no longer have to waste time in traffic and have bosses and colleagues looking over their shoulder. They got their wish. Some of them should be careful what they wished. 14 months later, we are less anxious about catching COVID and more hopeful about the economy's prospects. In fact, as you just heard, fellow recruiters are seeing a boom in demand. I have my opinions about that. We'll talk later. I think we're also cautious because we've been blindsided before, and the news has changed, and it changes our future on a dime. It also changes the stock market on which many of us depend for retirement on a dime. So even when the COVID news is great, unrelentingly positive, and so forth, I think most of us are still hesitant to count our chickens. Very few that I've met are fully confident. So I put that out there as we're probably closer to the finish line than we were a year ago, but I don't think we're fully out. And because it's now a global workforce, we should be careful. Don't let your guards down, please. Okay. Because we're all remote, and it's been a ride. Let's take a look at what companies are doing about it, because they are the source of the fuel for our careers. Many companies will not demand fully on-site work. Many companies, especially big companies, Microsoft, SAP, and so forth, have gone remote only. That means they are committing not to require a return to on-site work. They'll make it optional, but they won't require it. On the technology worker front, I've seen polls where a full 30% of today's tech workers say they will resign if they are forced to return to physical office. So companies in the wake of COVID are also demanding, well, not demanding, but stating strong preferences for staff employees, much more than they used to before the pandemic. Before, the market was tight for labor, and any shape or form would work. Lots of demand for staff, but an equal amount of demand for contract. I think companies are seeing long-term opportunities for tech writers, for any kinds of staff people they hire, in fact, and I define long-term as 18 months, and therefore they don't want to pay overtime rates. They are steering away from contractors. In California and other states that are following California tax law, they are also leery of legislation that started in January of 2020 called AB 5 for Assembly Bill 5. And that removes the benefit of the doubt, if you will, from a lot of contract tech writers, makes it much harder to qualify as an independent contractor, even if you're incorporated. The acid test is now, are you contributing to your client's core product? If you are, you're an employee. It doesn't mean you're a staff employee. It means you might be an hourly W-2 based contract worker, but you need to be classified as W-2. That changes the rules. It's not a COVID thing, but it more or less the same time came along our way and people responded. Companies need a lot of help. They would prefer, as I said, to hire staff, but they can only hire in the countries where they have a physical office. They have an office presence. That's why you'll see jobs listings that say remote only in the US, remote Canada, remote EU, remote wherever the country's got a physical presence, they can hire staff with benefits. Contractors can still live anywhere and be autonomous, but their competition is global. So there's price pressure on contractors who are working outside. Well, there's price pressure on contractors, period. Because a lot of these companies ignored their technical content and tried to fill the sales funnel with marketing content, the product of content writers, they're finding now that UX and DX writers, that is user experience and developer experience writers, are now more valuable than marketing content writers. That means they're more interested in hiring these people and they're willing to pay more. Content writers have had a nice long run, and they're still necessary for filling the funnel. But let's say the bar is low for content writing. You can have, well, forgive my words, but crap coming out of content writers, and people pay and people post, and that seems to be okay. For tech writers, the bar is higher and the quality needs to be higher. So compensation is going up when the technical writer, when the worker has in-demand skills. We'll cover what's in demand in a moment. Okay, so first of all, let's cover what's the advantages and the disadvantages of all remote. These are basically self-explanatory, thinking out loud comments, but I'll read them to you anyway. You don't have to physically commute anymore. You're not losing hours of valuable time in traffic. You have a higher earning potential relative to your cost of living if you are not in a high cost of living place. You have, well, the illusion of personal privacy. It's not online, not the online kind, not the e kind, but you don't have anybody looking over your shoulder, and you can temporarily, in theory, go dark. Um, you also have, this is for the introverts among us, less stress from social interactions. There are a lot of technical writers who feel like they don't belong in the contemporary workforce because they are older or more seasoned or less interested in slamming back vodka and um, Red Bull mixers. That's not their cup of tea, so to speak. Um, so they don't necessarily share a value system or share values with millennials and Gen Ys and Gen Zs. The last two items I put asterisks after that because higher productivity is in theory, as is a balance between work and family. I've noticed, as I will discuss on the next slide, that there is a lot more demand for long hours. In fact, there's the expectation of long hours and availability with very little notice to participate in meetings, to get on Slack sessions, to what have you, to be there when you're needed. So if you're in an expensive neighborhood and you are trying to compete with a global workforce or even a workforce in the Midwest, you are at a disadvantage. That really goes without saying. It's a fuel for a lot of people leaving the Bay Area and leaving the East Coast. Um, Pay attention. I don't know if those people will have made the right decision in the long run. I've seen this happen half a dozen times in my tech career, 30 years, 35 years. Companies say, "Oh, you can work anywhere. In fact, we really don't want to house you. We don't want to pay for parking space or a cube." And then they change their mind. IBM did it. Cisco did it. A few other companies have done it. "Oh, you need to come back or you won't have a job." And they get to do that with impunity. And the people who have relocated and can't afford to come back or have just outgrown the race that is Silicon Valley, they don't come back. They lose their jobs. They are forcibly aged out of this wonderful game we call tech. And that's not fair. And there's no way to guarantee that your company, your employer, won't do that to you. Other disadvantages of the all remote universe, there are fewer serendipitous encounters. There's a lot less playfulness and camaraderie. There's a forced nature to a lot of the communication because it's all electronic and you could be recorded. For extroverts, there's a lot less fuel from interpersonal interactions. They are weakened by the pandemic-related changes because they don't get to play off the energy of others. They don't get to be spontaneous. That affects a lot of people's desire to return to the in-person workforce and on-site. How have we reacted in general to this new normal? Many have had to consciously prioritize mental health. They realize they're stressful, they're stressed, their relationships are suffering, their preoccupation with staying healthy or their family situations have begun to take a lot of their energy. They consciously schedule me time, even though, frankly, the workload remains infinite. As I've indicated, they certainly consider moving away. I can't guarantee whether that's the right thing to do, as I discussed, but it is something that for many has been a no-brainer. Like, hey, our house is appreciated. We could afford to go this place or that place, have fast internet, and be as effective. I hope that's not short-sighted thinking. Okay. What else do people do? They market their services outside their usual commute radius and sometimes outside their usual industry niche. That's wise to have a defensive option because there's no telling what a globalized workforce will mean for the future of people who have counted on high prices because they live in an expensive neighborhood. Um, this is a no-brainer, but you have to improve and expand skills to remain competitive. That's something that you should do regardless of COVID, regardless of anything. If you recognize your job description or your personal responsibilities 12 months after starting a job, worry, because ultimately you will regret sitting still and becoming furniture. Finally, some people are saying enough already. I no longer have that fire in the belly. I no longer want to work those hours. I no longer want to have to uh, mind meld with 20 somethings. I'm going to focus on exiting. I'm going to accelerate my plans to retire. That is especially true if they cannot catch up with industry expectations for technology expertise and so forth. So what is in demand? Well, some of this is very familiar to people who were in the market pre-COVID. Technology and experience win the day. Tools experience, to a lesser extent, equate with high demand, not always, but often. Work experience, that means years in the workforce, depth of experience with a given subject material that isn't necessarily technology related. Maybe you're a single sourcing expert, or maybe you are an information architect. That doesn't translate to high demand reliably. So the number of years you've been in the business can become a liability, because people think, oh, well, I'm paying that person for 30 years of experience. I only really want 3. I just want them to have learned it once and not to have too many bad habits. That's just, I don't want to overpay. I don't want to pay for stuff that I will not be able to use. And I really don't want someone who is going to argue with me when I direct them to do something and they say, I know better. That's not part of the hiring plan. So post-COVID, what is more in demand in terms of kind of soft skills slash hard to define inchoate traits? Being highly available. That means I don't insist on working an 8-hour day or a 9-hour day. I'm there 14 hours a day. If you need to reach me, I've got my phone with me. I will not get on a call with moments notice. I'm a cooperative person. I am tireless. I've got that fire in the belly to impress and to be to perform regardless of the context. And I'm diplomatic about it all. I'm not someone who is going to make their agenda making someone else wrong. That is essential in a market where people are working virtually and will read too much into the tone of voice or the tone of type. You don't want to take risks there, because unfortunately in an online world, you might be easily hired, but you are also easily replaced in some cases. Okay, what to expect from the latter stages of the COVID market and the future? I would say that for the software industry, at least, on-site work is the exception and will remain so for at least a year. As I've indicated, the market for talent is much, much broader. Perhaps not global yet, because companies can't hire on staff outside of countries where they have a physical presence, but it's getting that way. And maybe if tax laws change and companies can hire outside their domicile or outside countries where they are have a physical presence, we will suffer mightily with pricing pressure. So be wary there. There is demand from companies in expensive markets. They think they should pay less for remote talent because, hey, that person doesn't have to pay our tax rates, or they don't have to pay our insurance prices, or fill in the blank. We should be able to find qualified, willing souls anywhere on the planet, or at least some cheaper. Um, when they do, and these undocumented or underdocumented products finally ship, or the companies run out of time and founder, there will be intense pricing pressure. Um, when the current talent gap is filled and products ship and people learn better how to deal with remote work, there will be pressure on expensive talent to lower their costs. That scares me. That is the other side of the coin for us recruiters who think, oh, great, now I can hire from Indiana rather than from Fremont or from San Jose. Um, that's that's nice, but there is another side to it, and local candidates will will see that. Um, that said, writing in the software world is mostly secure, if a little lonelier, whereas any non-software centric kind of writing, hardware writing in particular, becomes a lot more challenging. Doing it remotely, that's challenging because you can't see it and you can't touch it, and you're limited in your senses and your ability to document it and explain it. Um, most job seekers will continue to encounter indecision and very slow responses. Recruiters typically lack technical focus. They have a very weak understanding of the audience their people they're hiring are trying to satisfy, and they are reliant for the most part. And I would say that expert support and synergistic communications, my firm, are exceptions here. Most technical recruiters rely on that blunt instrument called automation, application tracking systems, and searches for keywords in order to unearth talent. It's a messy, sloppy, scary process for the candidate, and a desperate process for most recruiters. Um, but that means the candidates need to search engine optimize their resumes. There really is no other way around this game. Um, if you are if you are looking for experience outside of an area where you know you're going to find it instantly, you need to do their thinking for them. Do not make hiring managers think because they've forgotten how. Um, the market, if you want to, in a nutshell, the tech comm hiring market is the tech comm hiring process is a consensus driven quote, how can we exclude the undeserving process rather than one in which the ethos is how can we accommodate the high potential candidate. Basically, we're looking to exclude rather than include. I wish it weren't this, but that's just the way it's become. Finally, travel and in-person team building, really rare. Will remain the exception. Most companies have long since forgotten how to train their people. Any training they offer will be informal, will be sporadic, and will largely be as a result of the worker's own initiative because they're remote and they're reliant on e-meetups like this one, on MOOCs, which are basically things like well, there are many from LinkedIn Learning to Udacity to well, fill in the blank. There are lots of them, and to online conferences. For example, the Write the Docs conference in Portland was for the second year in a row just finished up, and that was a fully off-site virtual conference for which it is possible to get all the videos in one place for free. So make use of that. It's not optimal for all learning styles. If you're auditory or a visual learner, great. If you're a kinesthetic or a tactile learner, not so great. So understand that that's the fact of life, and there's nothing that you can do about it in the near term. My expectations for tech writers in the next 18 months to be to cap it a little bit, if you were an early career tech writer seeking opportunities in a small company, you have you can expect no or negligible training. You got to be really resourceful. You got to be really tenacious, and you have to be both technical and self-motivated. Essentially, grit counts, and grit, in my view, counts most. Those people who have succeeded in getting into fast-moving young companies do it through persistence and stamina and paying close attention to what is required from the job descriptions. If you are a mid to late career looking for entry into a small company, you won't get training either, but your understanding of the relevant technology, of the target audience, and to some extent of best practices, at least as long as they align with the company doing the hiring, those are extremely valuable and will get you noticed. And for the most part, those will be the differentiators in getting you hired. So again, understanding of the technology, understanding of the target audience, and understanding of how to make something from nothing using best practices, or at least not worst practices. If you are early career and looking for opportunities in mid to large companies, you might get mentored, you might get trained, but you might not. These are really hard roles to secure, but they are attractive for their comparative job security, for learning good habits from experienced people, and for saner expectations of in terms of scheduling and also in terms of producing. So I think larger companies realize that it's hard to hire and it is important not to fry your person, your hire, so that they leave before they've delivered ROI, if you will. Finally, mid to late career people looking for mid-size or large company opportunities, you're going to be the most respected and secure of any kind of tech writer, and you are going to have the most survivable professional existence. There will be fewer stock price home runs, but there will also be fewer layoffs. Essentially, it's an opportunity for adults to thrive, and it is as such. Younger companies and at different stages of your career, in my experience, not so much. Okay, what about other specialties? Not just tech writers here, but people who do other things for a living. This is not a comprehensive list, but I will share some thoughts on other specialties. People who do instructional design, courseware development, especially for the e-learning world, these people have finally and fully displaced the ILT, the instructor-led training, where you have in-person class attendees and essentially somebody at the head of a class where all your students have flown in and are staying in hotels and are there paying $1,000 up and up a day. There is no more of that, and there won't be anytime soon unless a miracle happens. For the translation, localization, and internationalization world, those are becoming a lot more automated. This was happening before COVID, but AI-assisted tools like Acrolinks and so forth, the tools that provide real-time captions for YouTube and so forth, these are considered sufficient, and I don't see a happy future for most people in the localization and translation world unless they are tightly bound to the data universe, and even then it's going to be hard. The content strategists, depending on how you define a content strategist, they can get traction if they can prove a return on investment, an ROI. Otherwise, in my experience, these people who say, oh, I'm a content strategist, really what they mean is I am an overqualified content writer. I can tell you how to fill the sales funnel. I can tell you which ads to run when, where, but that's about where I lose any expertise. And people will, especially management, will start getting skeptical of that if they haven't already, and say, I don't want to pay $200 an hour for content strategy consulting. I want somebody who can give me quick, reproducible, and maintainable solutions now, and understand the technology and go ahead and implement it rather than just preach. UX writers, UX user experience writers can also gain traction if they can prove ROI and they can get early access to the products they're helping with. Otherwise, they will quickly be deemed too expensive. For those of you who don't have the experience that I've had in the Bay Area, UX writers cost more than tech writers, sometimes by a factor of 150%. That's not sustainable. Um, that will not last. And if these people can prove that they can add that kind of value, let them document it. I think it's a novelty for companies that are so used to finding hostile user experiences. But the bar will rise, and the UX writer will have to find other ways to prove value. Finally, content writing. This is the arena of filling the sales funnel. If you can do it the first, with an accurate draft the first time, and you can get qualified, informed buyers loaded into that funnel, great. Otherwise, if you're a sloppy writer, or if you can't tell who the audience is or what the audience needs, you have wasted that company's best chance to make a good first impression, and you will be shown the door. That is my prediction. I've predicted this for a long time. I think we're more likely to go that direction than ever. Okay, what else did COVID change? The hours longer, and less sympathy for someone who is working the same workday as headquarters, if you will. If you're on the West Coast and you're only expected to be available during West Coast business hours, you'll get a lot less sympathy, and you'll be asked soon, if it hasn't already happened, to be available to Europe and to be available to India or to China, and your hours will extend. You may not be working flat out for 12 to 14 hours a day, but you will be expected to be on. There will be less spontaneous interactions. I've alluded to this earlier, but people are wary, and interactions on Slack and the former water cooler conversations, those are anything but free flowing. Many people have told me that interactions that used to happen 4 or 5 times a day now only happen once a week. So there's a lot less magic to the interaction with your colleagues. In the same sense, there is a lot less camaraderie, because work is different when you can't really get to know your colleagues. Since we're all limited to only 2 senses, sight and hearing, our brains can't function in the way that they might otherwise when when you can sense more and you can read between the lines, so to speak. Anyway, we're inhibited. Everything we hear and say is possibly going to be recorded. Even informality isn't really safe in the strictest sense. So I think that people who are used to casual conversations around the water cooler won't surrender that anxiety anytime real soon. Finally, there's no real way to differentiate, to decide or to predict how tech comm career paths might have shifted. It used to be that a lot of tech writers said, "Oh, I want to be a project manager. I don't want this, deadline craziness where I'm the least important resource in the puzzle. I want to be a project manager, use my project management skills, or I want to be middle management, or I want to be a product evangelist, or I want to get into UI writing or UX writing or content strategy, as we've discussed. Extroverted techies, I think, will be in great demand as product evangelists, but introverts, introverts who are largely invisible and are forced to stay that way, they're going to be they're going to have a harder sell to transition and climb the ladder. So be wary that this is a longer term impact from COVID. I would love to hear some alternate points of view there, but I think management is looking for ROI, and um, they're going to be able to keep their tech writers busy for a while yet. They're not looking necessarily to promote a tech writer to management or outside of the tech comm world. Um, Also, I'd advise that in this new post-COVID world, some of the roles that I've outlined are going to be a whole lot more professionally unstable than tech writing is. Being an individual contributor tech writer is comparatively stable. Those of us who worked in the 90s and the aughts and even a decade ago remember what it's like to be last hired, first fired, and mostly ignored. Tech writers are more necessary and more acknowledged as doing the work that others don't want to do, the important work that others don't want to do. So it's likely that we will have security for a while yet. Um, I'm going to finish up here with a bunch of questions, and I will read the questions and I will summarize my quick answers, and then I will look forward to uh, your questions in response or your questions in addition. So, will employers return to full-time in-person office work? I would say in the software development world, most won't. A double-digit percentage of tech companies have adopted on-site optional or fully remote for all workers. That is that has become the new norm. Um, the hybrid, partly on-site, partly off-site world, that exists for those who want it, but again, those who can steer their own future, dictate their own fate, reserve the right to quit if they are told, thou shalt be on site. So I'm often asked, what is keeping workers from wanting to return? Surely they all want more camaraderie and more fun and games and so forth. To that, I answer so many things. Their kids are still doing remote learning and they can't find or afford daycare. This doesn't often happen in the tech world. It certainly happens elsewhere. They also don't trust their employers or their colleagues or their fellow commuters to take COVID precautions. Not everyone is being conscientious there, and it only takes a variant of the virus to ruin your day. They're more productive at home, or at least they think they are, and they really don't like commuting. Um, they're embarrassed because perhaps they've gained a few pounds, or their social skills have atrophied, or they haven't invested recently in their wardrobe, and they really don't want to bother with that. Um, Obviously, if they've moved away and turned their expensive homes into investment accounts, they don't want to be forced back to work in an office that is in an expensive neighborhood. To quote from the Eagles, you can check out any time you like, but you can't afford to return. Um, so they also need the flexibility of handling personal and family obligations during business hours. In other words, they've gotten busy handling life and being told, nope, can't do that anymore. That doesn't work very well. Finally, and this is something that we're all conditioned not to talk about, but workers are burned out. They're burned out from the trauma of the global pandemic, of personal loss, of ultra divisive politics, of attacks on Black, Asian, and LGBTQ communities, and pretty much unrelenting loneliness, or the alternate, proximity to incompatible others. It's it's not been pretty, and we're all trying to pretend that we're survivors. But I think there will be mental health costs for this that we haven't begun to fathom. I'm often asked, is the job market better now? Well, there's more demand, and there's certainly more demand for software development savvy tech writers, people who know the Docs as code world, who have a little software development experience perhaps. Those people can more or less suggest and get whatever price they ask, regardless of how close a fit they are in terms of other aspects of the requirements list in the job description. Um, Technical trainers are also in demand. It's been easily 5 years since I've seen any demand at all for technical trainers, people who create the coursework or do who educate their audiences in the features of the product in a one-to-one or recorded one-to-one fashion. Also, technical content writers as opposed to non-technical kinds. Many companies have realized they have an enormous tech debt. I won't go back there, but the vast majority are staff and salaried roles, suggesting companies expect to be able to keep them busy for 18 months plus. So this is an unusually strong candidates market for staffers. It is less strong for contractors. There's still hesitancy for contract labor. They tend to hire contractors when they can't find staff people. Is the hiring process different now? I would say it's more of what it was. It's more automated. It's more keyword driven. This was, as I said, largely true before COVID, but it's intensified. Hiring managers and in-house recruiters who actually read resumes and perform initial screens of candidates with a brain, that is, using their brains, are all but extinct. These people are being turned into production monkeys. It's sad, but that's what their clients and their employers demand. For contract opportunities, what you need to know is that in most cases, large and medium-sized companies hire managed services providers or MSPs. These are large generalist IT agencies that serve as applicant gateways and legal compliance enforcers. These in turn engage a whole bunch of low cost and really low expertise sourcing services, typically on the subcontinent. And these people in turn search resume databases, Indeed, Dice, LinkedIn, for keywords. And then they create contact lists, and then they email and call the heck out of that contact list, trying to secure from you, the candidate, the right to represent, which allows them to exclude their competition relative to that client and that opportunity. They then submit your resume or the selected candidates' resumes, or rather, they don't, but they claim they do. And everyone prays that the spaghetti sticks to the wall and that they get traction. So that's what happens in the contract world for large and medium-sized companies. For staff and salaried opportunities, large and medium-sized companies typically rely on in-house generalist IT recruiters, typically working on contract, to search their ATSs, their applicant tracking systems, and then conduct candidate interviews, mostly doing behavioral phone interviews, sometimes asking technical questions, but less frequently than we might like. Then they arrange for virtual interviews with the hiring team, and then they check references. That's what happens with the staff and salaried opportunities at companies that are medium and large in size. Startups, by contrast, they fill both the staff salaried and contract opportunities using IT recruiters and word of mouth referrals. This is where personal network connections really make the difference and have a strong influence over hiring decisions because, frankly, there's more than one person's skin in the game. There's more than one person's motivation to remain productive and focused and to not be a disappointment to the person who referred you. Niche-dependent recruiters like Synergistech prove most helpful in the startup company world, in my experience, because they have a deep understanding of the industry. They have long-standing relationships with candidates. They often are the only bidder when introducing talent to a hiring team that is actually funded and motivated and can make decisions. Um, Independent recruiters don't typically deal with managed services providers. They don't typically deal with conflicted hiring committees or CFO driven agendas. Can we afford it? Where should we spend the money the most efficiently today rather than yesterday? Specialist independent recruiters can also ensure that candidates don't leave money on the table because they are typically the ones who know better than the hiring manager what that talent can earn elsewhere. And they will educate the hiring team about, gee, you've asked for this set of skills. I found you that person. That person can go any number of places and earn 15% more than they're asking. This is a take it or leave it story. You don't have the opportunity to push back on pricing if you actually want to hire this person. You can play games, but that person's not going to wait around. An independent recruiter dares do that and typically wins that debate. Okay, next set of questions. Can independent recruiters find entry or junior level work post-COVID? Not your best bet. These are not typically the scenarios in which independent recruiters are likely to help you. Here's why. We work on commission, and it costs companies at least 20% more to hire you through an agency, or basically through an agency, than if they'd found you without our help. That makes you, unless you're willing to lower your prices, which I do not recommend, that makes you uncompetitive when you're represented by a recruiter asking for the same price as somebody who's not recruiter represented. So recruiters are good. Recruiters can help you build your network. I am more than happy to help in that respect in a not-for-profit kind of a long game scenario where I introduce you and you introduce me someday. But if you're looking for somebody who's looking to be paid for every effort, independent recruiters, any recruiters, are unlikely to help find that first job for you or even that second job. Just be warned. You may notice that there are a lot of job opportunities asking for 3 to 5 years of experience. This started during the pandemic, as far as I can tell, and it's very pretty. These companies think that they only want that much experience and they don't want to overpay. I know it has discouraged more experienced talent from applying. That's unfortunate, as in my experience, and this runs pretty deep. In my experience, companies will agree to pay whatever it takes to hire somebody with the needed technical skills. They care a lot less about the quality of your writing, how long you've been a tech writer, or the fact that you have experience with industries or technologies that they don't deem relevant. Again, if you have technical skills, they pay attention and they will have a very strong interest in not letting you get away. So if it says 3 to 5 years and you have 35 years, apply anyway. If this is basically efficiency, but I wonder also whether they're scared of hiring people who know more than they do and might be, quote unquote, hard to lead. You can draw your own conclusions there. Last question, which I hope is provocative. Is this a good time to retire? I bring this up laughingly because STC community seems to be to trend older than the Write the Docs community. There are a lot of STC folks who would like to exit. They're looking for the right time. They're looking for the writing on the wall. I would say that if you've lost your enthusiasm for the work and you can afford to do it, this is a good time to retire. You can do it gracefully. You can basically use COVID to be the air under your wings, the wind under your wings, and do it gracefully. You don't have to say, I quit. You can say, I quit in 4 months. You have this much time to replace me. But tech comm work, without a doubt, is getting harsher and more impersonal, faster paced, and more tech-centric. So unless you're hungry and unless you're innately fascinated by the products and you are zealous about the mission, in my opinion, it's getting less gratifying to be a tech writer every year. It's achievable, but it's gotten joyless. And you can quote me. Okay, so I can opine on the San Francisco job market. I can advise about resumes and salaries and interviewing and portfolios. I do all that for free. Basically, this is relationship building. Tech writers talk. Tech writers like to help each other. I was a tech writer. I still have that trait. So if we don't already know each other, let's connect. Let me know how I can help and march forward. Thank you. I'm done.
All right. Okay, real quick, I don't know if you're comfortable with this, Andrew. Do you have anybody who wants to maybe ask some questions at the moment? We do have a little bit of time. Unless if you're okay with it, Andrew. Oh, Sharon, go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Andrew. I am actually in Atlanta, Georgia. I am in STC. I'm actually the vice president of the Atlanta chapter. I have a personal question though.
Hi, Sharon.
Hello. I've been looking into accessibility, the IAAP, and they have a web assistant specialist certification. And I wonder if you can speak to, I enjoy that kind of thing. I've done some volunteer work in that area with 11YA, but I want to invest the time in getting this certification, but I want to understand, like, can you speak to what the trends are there pre and post COVID? Are people interested in folks with that kind of knowledge base or expertise?
So tell me the name of the certification again, please.
It's the WAS, the Web Assistant Specialist. I do believe it's with the IAAP.
Okay, so I am unfamiliar with that. Could you outline for me the skills that you would gain, and I can opine more specifically about those?
Okay, it's in the UX world. It's the idea of,
Okay.
you start with the user, of course, when you're doing UX or UI design, but you also start with like neurodiversity, things like people that have dyslexia. In your user understanding, you would actually bring in those who have accessibility needs. So that's teaching you how to, I think, kind of mesh those two together from a UX standpoint.
I see that that's interesting, and I see that some companies, primarily larger companies, would find value in that if those needs are not already met. Are you thinking of using this for primarily contract or salaried work?
Well, at this point, I'm really not picky. I don't have that experience. I don't have experience in UX. I'm transitioning. So I want to, whether it's contract or whether it's actually a salaried position, because I am in a position where I can move if I need to, and I also work remotely if I need to.
Okay. I see value to large companies that have to demonstrate that they're being inclusive and attuned to the neurodiverse and so forth. And I see a lot of the tech companies that I support saying, that's in the nice to have list. Do not expect most companies to go out of their way unless you have distinguished, unless you can prove how that generates additional revenue for companies. So if I were a recruiter trying to fill such a role, by all means, correct me if I'm wrong, others, but if I were a recruiter, I would say, I want to see proof of having a return on investment for including that expertise on my team. There are the Targets of the world, Target, the merchandiser, that got in a whole heck of a lot of trouble because they they didn't make their website inclusive to people who had alternate ways of surfing the web. I forget the actual context, but they got sued for a non-compliant
Hmm.
website. That's where you could make a splash. Most likely, you'll have to get that experience on salary, so it'll take longer to make top dollar from
Hmm.
it. Um, I would be cautious unless this is something that you love and know is part of your future. You're probably going to take a step back in earning potential if you say, okay, I've everything else being equal, I want to focus on the neurodiverse community or the alternate ways of learning strategy, because the buyer pool for those skills is smaller. It may be a happier ride, you may have fewer layoffs, but the management will be skeptical until you say and prove that you made former clients or former employers a bunch of money that was essentially being left on the table.
Okay, that makes sense to me because I was thinking it would probably be something where you come in as an expert, maybe just as a consultant, and then you're utilized. You have to prove ROI, and then it's thank you and goodbye, on to the next
Yeah.
one.
Well, what you're asking these people, the web designers and the web content writers and so forth, to do is rethink everything. So yes, you may advise and they may follow your advice, but they're going to have to work really hard for less than fully visible changes, because the number of web visitors who take advantage of your value add is necessarily small.
Okay.
That's why I'm saying it's something that I would use as a differentiator if a company has neglected that market,
Mhm.
but I wouldn't lead with it. I would
Okay.
lead with more commodity communication skills and expertise with their existing primary audience.
Okay. Got it. All right. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you for the question.
Right. See, Madeline, do you have a question? I think you're muted.
Yeah. Or Andrew,
Hello,
I'm
Madeline.
very fond of
Hi.
you. I want to disagree, or I want to
Still.
augment what you said.
That's very kind.
Guess what my job title is right now? Content strategist.
Okay.
So back to what is like UX writing and content strategy. Content strategy can mean what you described, but it can also be a higher end UX writer who can think more globally about the information architecture, who can be a leader, who can, take a team through maybe design thinking, that kind of thing. So
I've seen that.
and
I don't dispute that it can happen.
and you're right, it's a messy thing because that title also gets used in another way. So actually, so working in the UX world now, there's a shift to content designer. Since you're working with like a product or visual designer, that content strategists, I think, are more and more becoming content designers. I think it's a great field. If you're in UX writing, you can use the logic that you have as a tech writer, as well as the general writing skills, the ability to ask questions and all that. So I think it's a great field. And right now there's a big demand. I don't know what the future is, but right now there's a big demand.
And I wouldn't debate that. We are in an era of rising tides. I just caution the content strategists to be wary that they will be perceived as soft skills contributors, not the peers of engineers, and that when budgets get tight, they will be under exceptional scrutiny. So they need to show how they how they generated revenue, not just something else, not
And
just
yeah, I think
customer goodwill.
oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I think what you said about technical writers also applies kind of to UX writers and content strategists or content designers in that I think there's always more jobs for UX writers because that's the basic work. And I think you don't need as many content strategists usually to do the work. So that's something to be
Agreed.
aware of. But I mean,
Sure.
I personally think it's a great field. You have to have a lot of kind of social skills and team skills because you're dealing with everybody else usually.
Yes, you are. And you're having to persuade them. It's not just deal with them, but you are having to persuade and change their minds. And I guess my thinking is somewhat old school on this. Long ago, I was taught that engineers control the funding, at least in the software world. And if they don't appreciate the value you bring, your days are numbered. And it's a hard sell.
I'm in a big corporate, so my jobs in this field have been in big corporations.
Okay.
So it's so far, at least in my experience, been very stable. As I say, I don't know the future. It's very stable, and if you have an expertise in whatever the industry is, so much the better. But anyway, I just wanted to add that I think UX writing is a very viable option. It seems to pay well, and it's not so far from what people do in tech writing that I think you're right to list it as a related option.
It's become the domain of what used to be called the end user tech writer, and I think for good reason. The end user tech writer went extinct shortly after 2000 when the internet had a train wreck, and those of us who remember all the procedures writing jobs and the sysadmin doc jobs going to India and then Canada and then a few other places and not coming back. That's what I worry about a bit with UX writing and content strategy.
I guess I don't worry about that, to be honest. What I worry about is websites and apps are going to reach a level of efficiency and there won't need to be so many of us to maintain.
Okay.
Right. Hate to cut you off, Madeline. I think we do have another question. Reva, go ahead.
Hi, Andrew. Thank you for that lovely talk. It was quite enlightening for me since I consider myself to be an entry-level person. So it's nice to know the other side, how recruiters are looking at the trends. My question is, where you mentioned in your talk that there's a demand for docs as code and for technical writers with little software development experience. Could you elaborate a little on that, since that's one area that I'm interested in?
Sure. Are you asking me to define that, or are you asking me to talk prices or tools or what?
Prices, I think, would reflect your US market. So I'm just looking at what do I need to have in my arsenal when I'm sending out resumes. Since I'm under lockdown, I do have time to upgrade myself. So I just want to know what areas I need to focus on.
Okay, so without any doubt at all, you need portfolio samples that prove that you can handle Markdown or its alternate restructured text, that you can handle Git and do it without error, or Git or GitHub, and that you can work with a static site generator. The number of static site generators out there are innumerable, multiple thousands. Popular ones that you'll probably have heard of: Sphinx, Jekyll, Hugo, Gatsby, and on and on and on. There is no one way to get a static site generated. There are multiple tool chains. There are multiple UIs that help with this. But the more you can demonstrate familiarity, proficiency with the moving parts and create content in that with that tool chain, the better. If you're going after the kinds of jobs that value Docs as code expertise, you're basically going after API reference doc writing. You must have API writing samples. And this gets into the meaning of life question of how do I get that when I have a job? Most people will say, oh, find an open source project and contribute to that. A lot easier said than done, but can be done. Requires stamina, requires persistence, requires putting yourself out there and probably being willing to make some expensive mistakes. If you want to listen to Aaron Redshaw's presentation from last month to this same group, he had some interesting ideas. There are others on this call who can contribute their ideas, but a technical writer asking for that kind of work who does not prove that they can do generic API writing, that's a non-starter. I would recommend that you put those writing samples on a personal GitHub page. I would recommend linking to it from your resume. I would recommend linking to it from your LinkedIn profile. The more, the merrier, the better documented your project is. And by that, I mean, here's the context, here's what I started with, here were my limitations, here's how long this took, and here's what I'd do differently if I had more resources, time, money, blah, 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 so that they understand that this isn't perfect, that it is delimited by the real world, but that it represents your best effort to show initiative, to show mastery of the technology and the tools, and to go further down that road. There are a lot of clients, even some of mine, who will say, okay, I'm willing to hire such a person because I have a more senior person on staff, that the newbie can be the apprentice. But if they haven't already taken steps in the direction of the open source tool chain for Docs as code, if they haven't taken steps in the direction of understanding what the audience wants, they don't even get a phone call.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
You're welcome. You're so welcome. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, I think you do have two questions from the chat real quick. The first is, do you see requests for technical communicators with Knowledge Center Service or KCS experience?
Okay, I didn't hear the last of that.
The last
do
part
I
is
see demand for?
Demand for a Knowledge Center Service experience or Knowledge Centered Service experience.
Okay, does that mean knowledge base? Shall I assume?
I'm going to assume. I don't have the context for that, unfortunately. I'm just seeing it in the chat. Oh.
Thanks for asking. It's Francis. So KCS is a methodology for how to create mostly knowledge-based type of articles. It's often used when you're trying to generate, get the people doing the job. For example, at Salesforce, we did it for the site reliability staff so that they could create articles. And then it goes through a process where somebody who's skilled at basically cleaning up these articles and being able to put the finishing touches on them, but it, is knowledgeable in the KCS methodology, reviews them, and then they get added to a big old knowledge base. And if they get outdated, it is up to the teams who have expertise in that area to update them and curate them from that perspective. But it is actually a certified methodology, and I do see it, and I'm just sort of curious because it seems to me tech writers, I've been in the field for a long time, and it didn't seem like we worked much in IT, but now I do see more with IT, and I think the KCS methodology is something that works well there.
Excellent. Okay, so that's new to me. I will preface by saying I know little, but I will venture an opinion. I have a client that basically came to me and said, I need a technical knowledge base writer. I've got lots of use cases. I want someone to write articles or pieces to be hosted in a knowledge base context. And they more or less said, okay, go figure out how to install the following 15 products in an open source, in a Linux environment, and comment on how it could work for an audience. I would not dare put the average knowledge base writer in that situation. What I did is I put a programmer writer in, and that person is technical enough to have met the need. I also have larger client companies that are selling to the Salesforce universe, and they would love to find somebody who could emulate or at least understand Trailhead and how to author for that world. Trailhead is a proprietary format. Salesforce has, to my knowledge, not yet released the SDK, shall we say, for Trailhead, but it is the way that products integrated into Salesforce will eventually document themselves and provide on inbuilt tutorials.
I used to work at Salesforce. I'll tell you, it's not actually an SDK. It's just a way they've set up these articles. But yes, the type of training to help people get certifications, I think, is definitely the future. But ServiceNow, if you've ever heard of that, for example, that uses the KCS methodology.
Okay. Thank you. I'm better educated now.
Do you see more jobs in the security world? People saying, I want people who, understand better, how to harden networks and that type of thing, working on that type of documentation?
I see a ton of opportunity for tech writers who are conversant with secure concepts and willing to basically become DevOps savvy authors. So developer operations, DevOps, is the universe where security comes to the fore. It is the world where SaaS companies, software as a service, where the process of actually hosting those and keeping them secure is actually documented, mostly internal use. The number of tech writers who can do that work without too much hand-holding is actually too small for market demand right now. I expect to see a huge shakeout there. There isn't one answer to how to keep your network or your community, your online community, secure. We're a couple years away from best practices there. Tech writers who put all their eggs in the security basket are taking a risk because, like the system admin documentation world in the early 2000s, it will consolidate. There will be a huge amount of M&A activity, mergers and acquisitions, and the companies that get acquired probably will shed their tech writers. So I expect prices to decline, to descend when that happens. But until then, it's a buyer's market. So great right now. Long term, you're safer if you can get yet more technical than the security market currently requires.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.
All right, and then I'll go ahead and ask a question now, Andrew. I've heard I've seen some surveys for companies where they're floating the idea of a flexible work week, where you have people going into the office some days a week and then working from home the rest. While I would love to see that kind of thing happen, especially since I'm getting burnt out on working from home, the more cynical part of me thinks that people won't go for that in the long run, that we'll just end up going either back to the offices or staying fully remote. What's your take on that?
I think those who can afford to stay away will. Those who enjoy remote work. No, I mean, I don't think he's on the call, but Chuck Martin is the one who says that working remotely is a bug, not a feature, and everybody should be on site because that's where the action is. That's where the action was. But I think that we're getting used to the action being remote and staying remote. And I know a lot of people who have said to heck with the San Francisco Bay Area, or to heck with the Northeast, or to heck with even Austin, where prices have risen so high. And they're saying, if I can get the same earning power and be in the boondocks with a fast internet connection, I'm gone, because I don't like that universe. I don't like that speed of life. Maybe it's that they're older. Maybe it's that they've got family obligations. Maybe that they realize that they cannot afford another boom bust. They have to cash out because there's never been a better time. I think people who don't have a choice or don't know whether they don't know the downside of going back will agree to go back, and then will try to wean themselves from it, and they'll be caught because that's the new norm that management insists on. I think management is going to alienate a lot of experienced players in this industry by saying, we want you here and we won't hire you unless you show up. There's the former Siebel systems. I don't know those of you who know Tom Siebel. He created Siebel systems long ago. He sold to Larry Ellison at Oracle. Then he created a couple companies, and most recently, he created an AI company in Redwood Shores. This individual, whose son really basically runs the company, demands on site, demands people wear suits every day. That's his norm. Ain't gonna happen. It's just not. That's 90s behavior. You cannot dictate lifestyle to today's techie worker. If they can prove they're better remote, then it's management's problem to figure out how to get everybody on the same page. Because what the pandemic has proved is that talent, and as Google likes to call them, 10x talent, that is the person who's 10 times more productive, 10 times more proficient, those people are the ones that a company needs, and they must kowtow to that talent. Doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be a face-off, but any company that makes demands and thinks its way or the highway will lose.
Interesting. Thank you. Do you have any other questions in the meantime? Don't see any other.
I have one more. This is Sharon again. I don't want to take anyone else's opportunity to. Okay, thank you. I'm wondering what about medical writing? Do you see any demand there? I would think it probably will not go away, but do you see anything spiking, or what would the future hold?
I don't see spiking, but I see carrying on as they were. When I first became aware of medical writing 10, 15 years ago, medical writers weren't allowed to write. They were taking dictation from physicians and laboratory professionals on what needed to go into FDA compliant regulatory doc. These days, I see medical writers not being allowed to use scientific expertise, but being developmental editors for that content. And among the more cynical of medical writers, I think they would refer to themselves primarily as formatters. They take drafts of compliant content from the subject matter expert, and they make it acceptable to the FDA for regulatory filings. I see
that is automated too.
And a lot of that is automated. I see more demand and a brighter future, certainly higher pay, for medical device writers. These people also have to create regulatory FDA compliant content, but they are allowed to be closer to the tech writer norm. They are researchers, they are participants, and they are entrusted with authoring original content. Yes, the medical device writer content gets reviewed 20 times rather than half a time as the software industry does. But it is that industry hasn't figured out how to lay off people. I don't know why it is, but people go and go and go and go and go some more. And it becomes the refuge of the burnt out software industry tech writer. People say, I've despaired of software ever treating me like an adult and actually being respectful to the of my talents, and they go to medical writing, they go to a biorad, or they go to a intuitive surgical, or they go to a think surgical, or they go to any number of, they fill in the blank, and they're in heaven. They may earn less than software, but it's like a community of adults where people are taken seriously, and authors, technical writers among them. This no more games. This is not an engineer rules the world universe. And I smile to myself thinking that is the way out for a lot of technical writers who can repackage themselves, because the software industry is cruel. There's no other way to phrase it. It's lucrative but cruel.
It sounds like you would have to, the medical industry expects a lot of great tenure, a lot of underlying technical writing experience before you get into it, or can someone get started in medical writing right out of the gate?
I've seen people who bill themselves as editors, even as indexers, get into medical writing straight out the gate. All you really need to do is perhaps take a medical terminology class, demonstrate some interest in the product or the subject material, be able to carry on a 3 or 4 minute conversation with an interviewer about the relative merits of their technology versus the competition's. That's enough, because they trust and they have respect for the craft of creating helpful content. I can't see you guys. I can't see how many eyes are rolling, but that's not the norm in the software documentation world.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you again.
Sure. Yep.
All right. I think we're going to have
More
questions. We are getting close to time, but everyone, can we just get a big round of applause? And you're welcome to take yourself off mute for this for Mr. Andrew Davis.
Yay.
Thank you.
Thank you all. It's been a pleasure.